Hey everyone, I'm Gracie. Welcome to the Grace of a Military Child podcast. The world should know how unique military children are. We may look like normal children on the outside, but we go through some pretty extraordinary circumstances that shape us to the leaders we are today. Keep listening to hear the incredible journey this week's guest has been on. Hi Arlene, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well, and yourself?
I'm doing good. Thank you. So excited to have you on.
Yeah, I'm excited to be a part of this. I think an important message to put out to the world.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your parent who served and kind of what experience that was like growing up.
Yeah. So my father was, he was a helicopter pilot. And I think he got his wings in 1954. And we were stationed immediately to Germany, where we were there for 3 years. His first duty station as a pilot, I believe, was in Hanau, which is close to Frankfurt. Anybody that's been to Germany knows where that is. And then we were transferred to Pirmasens, and that's where I started kindergarten. And Pirmasens is a military post on the French border, close to Strasbourg. So then from there, we returned to the United States. He was stationed at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, which is an Air Force base. But he was a pilot that was retrieving. They were testing different bombs and stuff, and they would send dud bombs out into the White Sands Missile Range. And he was part of the crew that would retrieve them and bring them back. So from there, let's see, that was in the early to mid 60s that we were there. 61, I think we went there. And so during that time, trying to remember now, he began having severe vascular headaches, and he was then grounded for being a pilot and went to Fort Eustis, Virginia, and went to aircraft maintenance school. So the family packed up and we went to Virginia for 5 months and then back to New Mexico. And then from New Mexico, he got orders to Korea. And he went to Korea, and my sisters, there was 4 of us in the family, 4 girls and my mother, packed up and we came back to South Carolina, where my family's originally from. And we spent that year in South Carolina while he was in Korea. And that is the time period when President Kennedy was assassinated. And I remember being in the 6th grade in a music class, and they came in and, announced everybody was going home. And then they told us that the president had been shot. And I remember with my 6th grade wisdom, I was afraid that meant we were at war. And I was like, my dad's in Korea and he's never going to come home. And this is just terrible. So, but of course, none of that happened. He did come home, and we went from there to Fort Benning, Georgia. And in Fort Benning, Georgia, he was with the 11th Air Assault, which then was merged with the 1st Cav Division. And the 1st Cav Division was sent to Vietnam. And I remember the night that he left to go to Vietnam. It was the same as in that movie, We Were Soldiers, if anybody's seen that, and where we were all out on the parade field and in parking lots, and families standing around waiting for their father and husband's unit to be called, and they were loaded onto buses and then taken to a train station, and they went by train. There were hundreds of them. I mean, I can remember that, just hundreds and hundreds out there. And they went by train to Savannah, Georgia, where they boarded a boat and went by boat to Vietnam. So the morning after he left, my grandfather took who was also a military person, I might add, he took my younger sister and I in the car, and we came back to Beaufort to spend the summer with them. And we went immediately to Savannah to the boat docks. And my grandfather said to me, now, this is the boat that your father's on, that he's leaving, but you're never going to be able to see him. So, we were right down, we got out of the car and we're walking on the docks. And I looked up, and there stood my father in one of the portholes. He had seen us and he was waving and we were waving to him. So that was just, a very special moment for us to be able to do that. So my dad spent his year in Vietnam. We spent the year in South Carolina. No, we did not. I'm sorry. Spent the summer in South Carolina, and then I went back to Fort Benning, with my mother and my other sisters. I remember that terrible, terrible night that was portrayed in the movie. We were soldiers, that so many pilots were shot down on a mission, and all of the families, the wives, and all the kids, we gathered together in a few houses, just waiting to see who was going to get that visit from the chaplain and somebody notifying that their spouse was one of the people shot down. Fortunately, my father wasn't. He was on the ground crew as a maintenance person, so he wasn't in the air. So he came home from Vietnam, and we went to, where did we go after that? Fort Benning, Georgia. We went back to Germany, and we were stationed in Munich. By then, I was in the 9th grade, living in Munich with the Oktoberfest and everything as a teenager was an amazing experience. It really, I think my years in Germany during that did more to formate who I am now than probably any part of my growing up years. We have a closed Facebook group, Munich American High School alumni, and we still now, after 60 years, we are all still friends. There's groups of us, we get together in large groups, small groups. Whenever we can get 2 or 3 of us together, we call it a mini reunion, and the Mustangs gather. That's really fun and really special. I think that we have all maintained closeness and friendships from a time when there was no email, there wasn't Googling, there wasn't Facebook. You had to write letters to, keep in touch with people. And one of my best friends from that time period, I'll just refer to her as Gail, and her sister and some of the others of us all went to Washington, D.C. for a reunion back in, I'm going to say early 2006 or something. And when we got there, most of the people were from the classes of 1980, 1990. And there we were, classes of the 60s and early 70s. And I remember one person came up to us and asked us if we had been teachers there. We said, no, we were friends. We were students there. And they asked us, well, how did you keep in touch with each other? And they were amazed that we wrote letters. They said that's what you did back then. You didn't have Facebook. So we still to today maintain that very, very close relationship. And we stayed in Munich for 3 years. We came back right before the Olympics in Munich. I lived in North Munich. Our school was in South Munich, so we rode a bus across Munich to the school. And we did leave right before the Olympics were held in Munich that year. And from there, we went to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to a New Cumberland Army depot. That was a very, very interesting period for me because where I lived was a total civilian community. I don't think there was any other military brats in the school that I went to. They couldn't understand why I'd lived in Germany. I had questions like, did your parents move to Germany so you could learn to speak German? Is your mother German? Why? They didn't understand the concept of my father was stationed there, and that's why we went there. I remember one day coming home on the school bus, and one of my friends was crying, and I'm like, what's the matter? She was upset because her parents were making her switch bedrooms with her brother that afternoon. And she had been in that bedroom her whole life. And I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot imagine being in a bedroom even more than 3 years. And you've been there your whole life, and you're upset that you're just moving down the hall. That was just so funny. And I still tease her about that today, 50 years later. So from Harrisburg, I graduated from high school and I left home and went to Gainesville, Florida. And my dad, still in the military, was stationed then at Fort Lee, Virginia. And he was stationed at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. And then from Aberdeen Proving Ground, he was stationed at Fort Lee, where he eventually retired and came back to Beaufort, where he lived throughout the rest of his life. He just passed away 6 months ago, and was buried in his full military uniform, which was one of his wishes. The military was a very, very big part of his life, having grown up himself as a military brat and spending 30 years in the military. So that was my growing up years. And then I too married into the military, and my children were raised as military brats as well.
Yeah. Did you kind of, raising military brats yourself and being one yourself, did you kind of have an idea of what they were going through and what, struggles and challenges they were facing along the way?
I did, but I also, more importantly, was aware of the wonderful experiences they were getting and the maturity level they reached far sooner than their peers who were not military children. I think you learn to make friends much quicker. You learn to be more confident in yourself, because you constantly go through this renewal of you're the new person on the block, and so you have to reacquaint yourself and over and over again. And I think that attributes to a amazing amount of early self-confidence and self-confidence in children. So I don't really, I don't look at my growing up as having bad periods. I think that it was challenging at times, but it was a good experience. I can't really say that there were times when I would sit back and, I'm sure I did say, I don't like this. I don't like moving, because nobody wants to move and leave their friends. But I think all in all, I rated it as a positive experience. And I tried to make sure that my children did too. And I think they did. I think they are the people they are today because of that experience.
Yeah. Is there anything you would have changed about the way you grew up or, the way you were raised being a military child?
I don't maybe invent Facebook earlier. But no, I think that, look, it's been a long time now, but, it was difficult leaving your friends at times, but people were much better about writing letters. And so, as is obvious that because I'm still friends with all of them today, we did keep in touch and we made that effort to do that. And so I think maybe that instilled in all of us more of a need and an acceptance of maintaining friendships, as opposed to just, well, I'll see them, again, because you're in the same community and stay, in the same place. So.
Yeah, being constantly moving around, it's hard to stay in contact, regardless, technology or not. But, now kids have technology and they have Instagram and Facebook and text and whatever else there may be where they can easily stay in contact. And, back then there was not any of that. Right. You had to figure out how to do that and figure out how, to make time to write letters and to send them and things like that.
Yeah, I had a little address book back then, and everybody's name was in ink, but everybody's address was in pencil because you constantly had to change it. And I always tried to once I got into high school and realized that hey, we are all moving around a lot. I always tried to get an address from one of my friends of their grandparents or of a cousin that didn't move around, so that if I ever lost contact with the friend, I had another source to be able to reach out and say, hey, I'm a friend of Gail's and I haven't heard from her in 6 months. Have they moved or whatnot? So I always tried to make sure I had some means of permanent contact.
Yeah, because, you lose that one address.
And you're lost.
That's basically it. Yeah. It's not as easy, again, you can't just search for someone on Google or whatever and find them easily as you can now.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. You mentioned moving so many times. Was there a place that you enjoyed the most? Was there a place that you call home or anything like that?
I think that my best memories go more back to Oh boy, I forgot we lived in Oklahoma for a while too. Go back to my years in Germany, and maybe just because I was older then, and it was such a different experience. Living in a totally different culture. Um, it was a different time in the world where my girlfriends and I, we would get on the streetcar by ourselves and go downtown. We would get on a bus and go to another country, for a vacation, for a long weekend from school. Um, we, I think, had a lot more freedom than I allowed my children or my grandchildren are allowed. And I think that was maybe because of the different time in the world, and also totally different culture. In Europe, children get on streetcars and go to school and go to stuff by themselves at 5 and 6 years old. So it would have been strange for us not to do it as 15 and 16-year-olds. But I think that to go back to your question, it's probably the time I look back on with the most fond memories. And when we lived in Oklahoma, that was all fun. But I was younger for all of those experiences.
Yeah.
And then living in Harrisburg was so strange because I was the only military person there. So, I really, while I had a lot of friends, I kind of felt alienated, very different from everybody else.
Yeah. And, my dad had a 7-year break in service right when I was born, just about. I was 2 I was like a year and a half, 2 when he got out. And then he had a 7-year break. And so those 7 years I grew up, in the civilian world. There was like one other girl in my school who was a military child. And I believe her dad was Navy. And then my dad, about 2010 was like, okay, I'm going to get back in. And he got back in. And then that was about January, about actually a year ago from yesterday, my mom said. And he re-enlisted, got back in, and went reserve so he could have his civilian job as well. And then not even, about 2 years later, in November of 2011, in November of 2011, he stepped on an IED. So he had to go medical and get recovery. And then he ended up getting out. So I didn't even have the time to really move around. I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, in a suburb. And then we moved to San Antonio to Fort Sam Houston for his recovery. And we were there for a couple years. And then he got out and we moved to Florida. So there was not much moving around there. And it was just, those three spaces. And, not much people understood when I moved to Florida. You're a military child, you're new here, things like that. Nobody understood or could comprehend that. And while, in Ohio, I didn't even know what it really was, because I was raised in a civilian world. It was shielded from that side of it. And then, I was so exposed to it in Texas. And so when I moved to Florida, it was so different, so strange, coming back to that civilian world that, most of my life has been civilian, but it was so strange coming back to that space, being like, okay, right. Now we got to change back.
Yeah. And you mentioned your father stuffing on the IED and stuff. And, I think that is a reality that military brats live with. We know that our fathers go away to war, and we know that the danger that they're in. Whereas I think civilian kids, they can watch the news, they know the war is going on, but it's not personal to them. It doesn't touch and sit on the couch beside them. So I think that helps with maturity. Helping military kids to grow up and accept the reality of the world the way it is.
Right,
and children don't have to face.
Exactly. Going back to the drawdown in Afghanistan, nobody realized, my dad was in Afghanistan when he got hurt. And so nobody realized, they were all like, oh, it's a struggle for my dad. And yes, he was struggling, and there's no easy way to say that and no way around that. But those were like my hardest weeks. Like I was on the couch every single day watching the news. Like my eyes were glued to that TV and nobody understood because it's like, it's just happening. Like there's nothing you can do about it. And it's like, I always said because, we were right on his 10-year anniversary too. So that was even harder, but it was like, he left a piece of him over there. Like technically, like in a sense, I'm over there. Like there's a piece of me over there with
him. Exactly.
Yeah. And so nobody, like, if you're not a military child, like there are certain experiences like that you just don't get. And it's hard to explain things like that to a civilian child. And if you're living in that civilian community, it's like, you don't get it.
Yeah, and they don't get it. And, another interesting aspect for me, and, when my son went in the military and he went overseas to Kuwait during the war, and I couldn't breathe. When he came and told me he was going, my whole world crumbled. And, I was just like, no, and I had watched my father go to Vietnam and watched, friends' fathers go to Vietnam and not come back. But putting my son on a plane and watching him go to war was probably one of the most painful things I've ever gone through in my life. I mean, just, unfortunately he came home safe and sound to us, but it was very different putting my son on a plane than watching my father leave to go. And I don't know that a lot of people that haven't gone through that would understand that. Everybody would think, well, it had to be difficult seeing your father leave, and it was. Your child is your child.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you had your dad serve, your husband serve, and then you've had a child serve?
Yeah, and my son served.
So like, what's the difference kind of, you've seen like 3 generations of military, like, have you noticed like any changes like within the community or?
Well, I think the communities now, the civilian communities, I think they tend to accept and try to embrace the military communities, at least in the town where we lived. It's a Marine Corps town, which everybody always says to me, oh, was your dad in the Marines? No, he was in the Army. But, but I think that they embrace the military more. And I think, we probably have the news agencies and stuff that have brought that military life into everybody's living room. In Vietnam, you didn't, every afternoon on the news, see what was going on over there. There wasn't that constant newsreels. Whereas, and in World War II and stuff, you got a newsreel when you went to the movies. They would have little newsreels and stuff. And then with Vietnam, there really wasn't, there was the periodic and short-term newsreels that you saw what was going on. But with the more recent wars, I mean, every day, I mean, you keep CNN on all day long, and you can just see all day long what's going on. And, I think that has opened up the awareness for the civilian community to maybe have more of an understanding what the military family is really going through. I will say too, we did have a nephew who did go to Afghanistan and didn't come home. That was very difficult, especially if my husband commissioned him. And so it was, very difficult. We, as I said before, it's in our living room. It sits on our couch with us, the reality of war and military life.
Yeah. If you don't live it, you don't know it. And
absolutely,
you can try and understand it. You can watch the news all day. You can get all the information. But if you're not living it, if you don't know someone military, if you're, even if you know someone military, like a friend or whatever, it's still not the same having, your dad or your husband or your son, deploy, or, even you mentioned your nephew, like it's not the same. Having family serve in the military versus having a friend, it's a little different to another level.
Yeah, it's very different. Not even just a little, it's very, very different. So, but, it's still, I don't think I would trade it. I would still want to have grown up as a military brat and been a military spouse and exposed my children to that life too.
Yeah. Is there any like specific parts of your life that you can remember and look back on and be like, this is, so military child versus civilian? And a lot of people say moving because civilians don't move a lot compared to the military. But is there a piece of your life where you can say that is definitely, military child life right there?
I think having your father or your spouse deploy, go away to war, go to Korea for a year, go to Vietnam. Civilian kids, their father may travel or their mother may travel, 2 nights out of a week or something. But, having your parent leave for a year, for 6 months is something that is unique, I think, to the military family.
Yeah, I think so too, because it's not just, those couple nights here and there. It's, year or months or even years of, are you going to come home? When are you coming home? And, most of the time there's not a definite answer for that.
Exactly. And now I think though it is easier. They have, they have means of communication. They can do, Facebook, they can still see each other. The fathers can still say goodnight to kids, where that wasn't available when I was a child and, when my father was gone, and even my grandfather was in World War I and World War II. And, when he left to go to war, my grandmother had no idea when he was ever coming back. He was gone for 4 years at one time. And,
wow.
So that is totally, totally different. My father's brother was a pilot in World War II also and was shot down and killed, and his remains were finally located and sent back to the States in the 1950s. But, so that I'm sure had a big reason why my father joined the military as a pilot, trying to not become his brother, but honor his brother's loss. So, and my grandmother had to find that out by a telegram, and she had been traveling. My grandfather was stationed in Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, he was provost marshal of the Hawaiian Islands and had come back to San Francisco for a conference and a meeting or whatnot. So my dad, who was 16 at the time, and my grandmother got on a bus and went from Beaufort, South Carolina out to San Francisco to see him while he was going to be there for 2 weeks. And it was at that time that her son, my uncle, was shot down. And so the telegram followed them from South Carolina, so he had been missing for, probably 10 days before she, finally got the telegram and knew, because it followed her where she was traveling. So, that's so very different from notifications that we have these days.
Right. Yeah. My mom got a phone call when my dad got hurt. But most people get that knock on the door now.
Yeah.
No matter what the situation, it's typically the knock on the door. Just because we lived in civilian community, we got the phone call instead. But typically you get that knock on the door and, you don't get a telegram anymore. Like it's not, things have advanced since then.
Yeah, they have. And, it's a kinder way of having to learn devastating news like that now. Just having a postman hand you a telegram, which, back in that time, everybody, you open the door and there's a postman standing there, what it is, they all knew. I remember my dad, he answered the door when they delivered the telegram, and he, called my grandmother and, to come and handed her the telegram, and she read it, she dropped it on a table, and she looked at my dad and she said, "Let's go for a walk." And my grandfather was unavailable to them that day. And he says he remembered they walked all day long around San Francisco. And my grandmother didn't say a word. They just walked in silence until they went back home that night. My grandfather came home and they were able to tell him. So, totally different world. This world, she would have picked up a cell phone and called him and, you need to come home.
Yeah.
Instead, so many people were alone and didn't have that comfort of a family member with them.
Right. And even now, like, you mentioned on deployments and missions and things like that. We have Skype, we have FaceTime, we have Facebook. We need, we have all those means of communication. And whereas, even when my dad deployed back in 2011, Skype was just becoming a means of communication. Like we just had that starting. So I never got to experience a Skype call with my dad, but him and my mom would email. And so now, like, hearing other stories of younger children, like or even children my age who experienced later deployments in their lives, it's like, yeah, we Skyped, we called, like, we had conversations. Like, the only way for me to hear my dad's voice is we got these little Build-A-Bears before he deployed, and mine was like a camouflage bear, and I had like little camos on it, and so it had a voice box in it of his voice, and he recorded. It said "I love you, Gracie" on it. And he put it in the little hand. And so I, press that every night before I go to bed to, hear his voice. But now it's not that complicated. Not that that was complicated. That was so easy, to a 9-year-old, like pressing a button every night. Like that was so easy. But now you can actually do phone calls. You can actually, say goodnight to your kids if you, get the hours right.
Yeah, children don't have to forget what their father looked like for a year, or their mother.
Exactly.
They could see them. And, we did audio tapes too, little cassette tapes. And, with those, and even with letters, because, he could mail a letter every day, but they didn't come in the right order sometimes. So we would number the letters and number the audio tapes and stuff. And, so we did that while he was in Korea and Vietnam. So, yeah, that was our way of hearing his voice and staying in contact more.
Yeah, there's definitely so many ways that technology has advanced. And, for the most part, it has helped strengthen the military families and military communities. Like we would not, it's hard to live in those times where, you're like, okay, when am I going to hear from this person again? Or like, when am I going to hear from this person when I'm going to see him again? But now it's just like, you can send a text, you can call someone, you can, video chat with someone. It's so much easier. And, you still write letters too. Yeah. And it's very immediate. I have letters from when my dad was deployed. He wrote one letter that got to us. So like I still have those, and, those are important to me. And, I cry every time I read it, but there's things like that are just still so special. And sometimes going back a little bit to writing letters is so special.
It is. There's I think nothing more meaningful to get than a handwritten letter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, especially with COVID and the pandemic happening too, and, everyone locked inside, we had our phones, we had technology to keep everyone connected, but every once in a while I'd get a handwritten letter from someone, and it just makes me so happy to get a handwritten letter because, people still actually do that every once in a while.
Yeah. That's a dying art, but,
it is
a special one. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. So what kind of experiences did you have growing up that you kind of made sure your kids experienced, being military, that you're like, don't miss out on this?
I think the most part would be when I lived in Europe with my kids. I wanted them to see the vast differences in the culture. We lived in, and it was funny, I would take them to places where I had gone as a young child in the military, and my parents had taken a picture of me standing beside a tree in a neighborhood we lived in. I would take all my kids there and put them by that same tree and take a picture, And we went to a park in the Netherlands called Drawdown, which is a little miniature city. And, I have pictures of myself and my sisters all at certain places. And, I would take that picture and I'd replicate it and have my kids stand in the same place. And, so I always did that with them and tried, by that, showing them a little piece of my life, in my childhood. When we lived, when I went back with my husband, when my children were small, in Wiesbaden, and then we transferred to Flensburg, which is on the Danish border. And it was very, very close to East Germany. This was before the wall came down and Germany was still divided. And I took them on the train once, because to ride the train from Flensburg back down to Wiesbaden, you went along the East German border. And I remember the first time I did it, and they announced on the thing they were turning the lights off on the train and that we were going along the border. And well, I didn't immediately think East German border. So, I turned to somebody else on the train and I said, what border are we by? Because I knew we were just going south, and I'm thinking like, wait a minute. And they said, oh, East German border. And I looked out and there were the fences, and you could see the little community in the East German side. And I realized how that affected me, to know that, that's the whole reason for the military, is because we live in this free part of the world. So I took my children on the train ride so that they could see that and realize, that fence is there. It's not keeping us out of there. It's keeping those people locked in. They don't have the freedom that we have. They can't get on a train and go from Flensburg to Wiesbaden. They are locked in their communities. And we rode one day while we were in Flensburg, went on a day trip, and we went through the woods to this little place where the fence dividing East and West Germany was right there. And there were West German guards standing along, and they were just very relaxed. And, we got out and we were talking to them, and there was a little brook, and then there was a fence, and then a distance of maybe 10 yards, and then a second row of fences. And on the second row of fences on the other side were the East German guards, and they had German shepherds, and they were very staunch and rigid. They had their rifles on their shoulder, and they were walking along and they were watching us, getting out of our car and talking. So my youngest son was 5 years old at the time, and he was down on the ground playing in that little brook and picking up tadpoles and showing us. And so I asked the West German guards, I said, so where exactly is the border? Is it, the first fence in the middle of the fences, or the second fence? He looked down, he said, no, it's that brook. I just reached down and grabbed my son back out of it. And I'm like, well, you were in East Germany today and you didn't even know it. So, I to go back to your question, I think that was one of the things that I wanted them to see. And it really kind of hit home and made them more aware of what the military was doing, why it was so important that we did have a military presence around the world.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So one of the last questions I always ask is, what advice would you give to another military child?
Be in the moment where you are. Don't get to a place and start looking for, when do we transfer? When do we relocate? And I've seen too many other military spouses, when I was a military spouse, or even kids that, they put that calendar up on the wall and they know I've got 2 years and 6 months left here, and then I can go back home. Don't do that. Embrace where you are. Learn what you can from it. Get all the experiences of that particular culture, be it in the United States, in the Far East, in the Middle East, wherever it might be. Gain what you can from where you are.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your story.
Well, and thank you for doing this. I think it's important that the rest of the world, the rest of the civilian world, as well as other military, to realize there are some military people that don't appreciate the lifestyle they had. Mm-hmm. And I think if they can see what other people experience, maybe they can think back on theirs and rethink it and realize that it was a great opportunity.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You have a great day.
You as well. Thank you. Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of Grace of a Military Child podcast. If you enjoyed listening, don't forget to follow, like, share, subscribe, review, and comment. You can also follow us at Grace of a Military Child podcast on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram for more podcast-related content. If you or someone you know is a military child who would like to be on the podcast, please send us a message to one of our social media platforms, or you can send an email to grace.of.a.military.child@gmail.com. Tune in next Thursday to hear another incredible journey.